Welcome. My name is Kevin Wilson. I'm a board game designer, have been for 10 years. I also designed role-playing games for several years before that. I've been in the gaming industry for about 15 years now. And today's talk is about the business of game design and the business of being a game designer professionally, or at least selling games to game companies. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the financial aspects, the contracts, things like that you would want to know if you are an aspiring game designer who actually wants to sell and publish a game with a company. All right? So let's talk about this in order. The first step, of course, is you're going to want to make your game if you want to sell a game. And there are a couple things that you'll want to keep in mind when you're making a game for business purposes and then for the idea that you're going to sell it. And this is somewhat different than the idea that you're going to make a good game. I always consider that there is a difference between a game and a product. And those are two things that you have to keep separate in your head as a designer as well. You want to make the best game possible, but you're also looking to make a product that is going to sell in stores to people that people are going to want to buy. So part of that is going to be you're going to want to be aware of the game market, what sort of things out there. I'm sorry?
Wait a second.
No, nothing on the computer. No worries. This is just my scribbled notes. Don't worry. But the idea is that you're going to want to understand the market, and you're going to want to look at the other games out there and kind of see what the competition looks like, and understand what can be made and what price point, how much money you would expect to charge for different types of games. That's a very important thing to understand when you're trying to sell a game to a company. Because if they can't really fit your game into a price point and into a box and into a product that they're going to want to sell, they're not going to want your game at all. It's not going to be something that they're going to ever buy from you. So while you want to design what you love and you want to design games that are really good, you also have to kind of think about the more practical aspects of things. And that's something that is much harder for designers to do, I think. So like I said, look at published games that are already out there, especially if there's a company that you particularly want to work with. And if you're unpublished so far, start with a smaller company because they're much easier to work with and much easier to approach. But look at the other games they've done, see how many cards they have in it, how many pieces, what they charge for it, things like that. And follow that blueprint more or less as closely as you think you can and still make a great game, because that will make it very easy for them to publish your game and make a product that they can sell and that people will purchase from them. So it gives you your best chance. It increases your odds of selling the game, and that's what you're looking for. Because there's no guarantees that you're ever going to sell a game, but if you can play the odds as much as possible, that's what you want to do. The other thing that you need to do, especially before you show your first game to a game company and you're still an unpublished author, is you need to play test the heck out of it. You need to really, really hone it to the point where when you show it to a publisher, there's not going to be a significant issue when they play it. Because if it crashes and burns right in front of the publisher like that, they're not going to buy it at all. There's no way. So you want to make sure there's no significant issues, there's no questions that you have not answered or cannot answer on the spot when the publisher asks you what the answer is. Because if you are stumped, if you are stuck, then again, that becomes a point where they're not going to want your game, they're not going to want to deal with you. So you have to kind of do that and be on top of it. So that's kind of the first step, make your game. Next, you're going to choose a publisher and contact them. And like I said, what you want to do typically, again, if you're unpublished, go with a smaller publisher. The bigger publishers, they don't want to talk to you yet. They're looking for people who have a bigger name, who have a bigger audience draw for them, because they need to move many more units. They need to sell many more units of the game in order to make money on it, because they have many more salaries to pay for their employees. A smaller company that has only a couple of employees doesn't have a lot of expenses every month, so they can sell maybe 1,000 copies of your game and still make money. A big company that has 100 employees, they need to sell 10 or 20 or 30,000 copies of your game to make money. And so that becomes a very different standard that they're going to hold you to, and different types of games The bigger the company, the more mainstream the game has to be, the more wide appeal it has to have, because they have to have that sales. They can't do the niche products, the small hobby products, because it just won't sell what they need to sell anymore. And so you can see the difference between, a very small company or something really big is going to be very substantial in what they're looking for. And the bigger companies often won't even talk to you unless you have an agent anyways. So there's really no point in even messing with that until you're established. To contact them, typically, they'll usually have an email on their website or that sort of thing. Be professional about how you contact them. Typically, the best ideal situation is to set up an appointment at a convention that they're going to be at to show them the game. You want to be, like I said, professional about it, concise, have a very short description of your game, not too flowery or anything, and don't go into details because that can cause problems. You don't want to talk about the mechanics of the game or anything. Just say, here's a very brief description of I have this game about dragons that are, on the fire department. I don't know. And that's just a very short thing, and I would like to show it to you at, Essen or Gen Con or wherever. Can we set up an appointment? And, I need 20 minutes of your time or 30 minutes of your time. Don't overstay your welcome with that sort of thing, because they have a lot of things to do at those conventions as well. So at that point, if you have once you've gotten your appointment, or you've decided that you're going to go ahead and mail in your prototype to them, and you're going to mail it in, and believe me, you want to show them at a convention if you can. You don't want to have to mail in the prototype, but if it's your only option, then okay, mail it in and be done with it, and don't worry about it too much. Just make sure that if you send in a prototype, that it is completely playable without you. You're not in the box, and so your rules have to be written in such a way that people are going to understand it without you there. The components have to be labeled if you're using, as I often do, little glass beads and things like that. You need to label and explain what each component is so they know what the heck everything's supposed to be, because, it's not, otherwise they don't know anything about that. It's just, oh, what is all this junk? Okay, And you don't want them to have those moments of confusion or that feeling that you don't know what you're doing. And so the more you can cover that, the better off you are. But let's say you get your appointment and you're going to go show them the game at the convention. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get some friends and some not friends, if you can manage it, and you're going to demo the game to them in private, and you're going to show them how it works and practice that several times. And get your demo down a little bit, but don't get it so practiced to the point where you can't react to what they're going to say, because they're going to interrupt you and ask you questions and things like that. But you also want to have it down to where you can explain the game quickly, concisely, and most important, clearly. Play the game with them. If it all goes well, if everything lines up and they agree that they want to buy the game or that they're going to look at it, they'll take the game away for a while, most likely. It could be a month, it could be 6 months. Longer than about 6 months, that starts to become unreasonable. You don't want to deal with that. I've had people come up to me and say, well, my publisher has had my game for 4 years and they're just thinking about selling. It's like, get it back from them. No. You don't understand. Just get the game back from them. They're not going to publish your game. They've had it for 4 years. They're not doing it. 6 months, maybe a year for one of the really big companies if you really feel like you might win the lottery if you sell this game to them. But don't wait too long. It's not worth your time. But let's say everything goes well. They've played it. They've decided, okay, we're going to buy this game from you. So then you're going to have to get a contract together with them. And for an unpublished, the difference is going to be very strong for an unpublished game designer versus a published game designer. But I'll talk about some clauses that are common and just kind of go through this really quick and give you what information I can. This may not be completely different over here. It may be different than it is in the United States, but I think the companies that I've dealt with have all been kind of similar to each other in how they operate like this. What they're going to typically ask you is like, what kind of clauses are important to you in your contract. What is important? What do you want for your game? And usually they won't make an offer first of all, because that's not how it operates typically. They're like, okay, this is a great game. What do you want? Oh, great. All right. And so you have to really think about what is it that's most important to you to get your game published and everything. So if I can make a few suggestions to what you do want if you get your game published. First of all, you want cover credit. Under no circumstances, if you can at all avoid it, allow someone to publish your game without your name on the cover of the box. This is your career, or this is your future as a game designer. If you want to make this a career, if you want to succeed, the only way you will ever succeed is if you get your name out there on boxes that people can see. Having my name on Arkham Horror with Richard Launius was an enormous boost to my career. If I didn't have that credit, half of you wouldn't know who I am. I wouldn't be over here. I wouldn't have been able to do half of the things I did. But because I have that credit, it was an enormous boost. And so I have all these extra opportunities as a result. So get the cover credit, no matter what, if you can get that. Then they're going to talk to you about royalties. Royalties is pretty much typically how it always winds up being paid. If you're selling a game to a company, if it's an original product and that sort of thing, you're going to be paid in royalties. So that's going to be a percentage, and it's going to be either net or gross. And most likely they're going to talk to you, and they're going to want to do a net percentage typically. Gross means based on the retail value of the game. So if it's a $40 game or what have you, then you will get, and you had, for instance, if you had 5%, you would get 5% of $40. Net is going to be what the company is actually making off the game when they sell it, not what the cover price is. So they might get something more like $20 or even $14 because distributors and various other people take cuts. So 5% of that is a lower number. So just keep that in mind when you're negotiating that. Typically, for game designers, you're going to be looking at somewhere between 3 and 5% royalties. That's very typical. 3% is going to be when you're starting out more as kind of a unknown and that sort of thing. And you might even have to settle for 2% if you're having trouble getting the game published. Try not to go down below that. It's not much worth your time after that point. 4% and 5% come as you're more well-known. And it's not unheard of that people have been able to get 6 or 7%, but not many people can do that, and they have to have a very big name in the game industry to do it. The next thing you're going to want to do is get an advance on your royalties. So this is a lump sum of money that they're going to pay you up front before the game is published. And this is kind of your pay unless the game does well. So what this is going to be is, for instance, I often get $5,000 US, which is about 37.50 euros as an advance on medium-sized games or whatever. And so this is the money that will be deducted. They say, okay, we've paid you this money out of your royalties, and as you earn royalties when the game sells, we will subtract those royalties that we would be paying you out of that advance. And when it all is gone, okay, now we actually owe you $5,000 worth of royalties. Okay, now your advance is what they call paid out. And so now the game will begin to earn you royalties for real, because you got that $5,000 first, and that's an advance on royalties. But now it's paid out. Now you start getting a royalty check, typically every quarter or every year, depending on how it's going to go. So that's kind of the sort of thing that you're really going to be needing to understand and work for as a professional game designer, as someone who's looking to do this. So the advance on royalty, there's a couple of different terms that you might want to know about that. There's when you're going to get these advances. There's on signing, which is as soon as you sign the contract and you've sold the game, they will pay you this within usually 30 days. There's on delivery, when you turn in the game to them, and it's in their hands and they've approved it. And then there's on publication, and that's when the game is actually appearing on game stores' shelves. Publication is troublesome. If you can avoid it, do so. You may not be able to, particularly early in your first few sales, because if they never publish your game, they're not obliged to ever pay you money. And so, as you can see, that's very tricky, and it doesn't hold them. It doesn't create any incentive for them to actually publish your game. It would be nice, but we don't suffer if we don't. So whatever, So the on publication is very bad clause. If you can avoid it, get it on signing, or at least half on signing and half on publication at the worst. When they've paid you money up front on a game, then they're interested in publishing it in order to make that money back. So they've bought into your game, and so that's what you really are looking for from a game company. Other than that, there's not too many more things to go through. Rights reversion. There are the rights to the game, the design and such, that you're signing over to the company. And you typically want clauses in there that the game will come back to you under certain circumstances. For instance, if they don't publish your game within 24 months, then the game comes back to you, and it's yours, and you get to keep whatever advance they gave you. This makes sure that they're not going to sit on your game for 5 or 10 years and never publish it. The other thing is, if they stop publishing your game and it's out of print for longer than 2 years, 3 years, something like that, then you get the game rights back. And that's not always valuable, but Reiner Knizia, for instance, is very big on that clause, because you will have noticed that he will republish the same game with different companies year after year. And that's because he has those rights revert to him over and over again, and then he can sell that game again and again and again. And so he has to do no further work, but he keeps making money on that game, and that is one of the ways that he is able to succeed as a professional and succeed with it as a career. So that's a very important thing, especially if it's the kind of game that you could republish or retheme or do again. If it's a very specific game, or if it's a licensed game or something weird like that, it's not as big a deal. But if you think you could, sell it again to somebody else later, a year or two later, after it's been out of print a little while, then by all means get the rights back and do it again, because that's free money for you. There's very little work for it, and that's the sort of thing that you have to do as a designer if you're going to, again, earn money and make a living at it. So those are the main things that you really need to know. So let's start opening up to questions here, and I believe someone will explain the catch box here. So we've got this little microphone that everyone throws around, and when you have a question, just speak into it and make sure that you can kind of hear it echoing a little bit.
Okay, how about translation and international versions? Any clues on those clauses?
Translation and international versions. Typically, what one thing you can do is it's called a third-party licensing clause, which means that if they do anything based on your game, or if they get any licensing fees based on your game, you get a percentage of that money that the company receives. And typically that number is higher than your normal royalty. You might get 15 or 25%, but you don't want to take too high a cut on that, because again, you want them to have incentive to actually go license your game to other companies and to other places. But if you have, say, a 15% or 20% cut on all licensing fees, and someone buys in and does a foreign print run of your game, then whatever money that they pay to the original company you've sold it to, you'll get 15 or 20% of that money. So that's the sort of thing that you need for that kind of thing that you're talking about. All right? Next question. Go ahead.
Just on what rights you might have, how much choice do you usually have in choosing art or that sort of thing?
Don't get involved in art if you can. It's not your job. It's not what you want to be doing. Just make sure that the company that you're working with does good art, and that they have done good art in their games in the past, and they'll do a fine job. They'll have someone whose professional job it is to take care of the art for you. That's really what you want to happen. All right, next question.
Those 3 to 5% you mentioned, it was gross or net?
Those are gross, typically. Net. They're net. It would be about, I guess, double that percentage if it was based on, or no, half that percentage if it was based on gross. Net is a smaller number, you'll get a slightly higher percentage. Gross is a bigger number, you'll get a smaller percentage. So like if you want gross, you'd ask for 1 or 2% kind of thing. If you want net, you get 3 or 5%. I usually do net because again, part of it is you want to incentivize the company to sell your game as well as they can. And there might come a day where they have to, for instance, liquidate a portion of your game and they're getting pennies on the dollar for that. So if they have a gross contract, they're still paying you royalties based on the full price of that game. So they're probably just going to burn their remaining stock and throw it in a landfill or something rather than try and liquidate it, because that means they'll lose money paying you your fee. Whereas if it's a net contract, they'll take in whatever money they're able to get for it, and you'll get still your percentage of that, and they'll be incentivized to keep paying you money. You always want to make contracts that are good for both you and the company you're working with. That really it benefits you the best. All right, next question. Got a few floating up there. Yep.
Well, continuing on the art question, since art is also a quite important aspect of the game and the feeling of the game, how about if you have some specific person in mind you think is good for making the art? You can
certainly suggest it to them, but bear in mind that every special request that you put forward on your game, every extra bit of work for them, every extra bit of favor they're doing you, it eats away at the credit of what they're willing to do for you. So you might wind up having to have a worse contract in order to have this artist that you specifically want, or they might even ask you that you front part of the money because they're a very expensive artist, for instance. And so what if we pay you this less so that we can pay this artist this much? So you can do it, but I don't recommend it because, again, you want to be easy to work with. You want to be no trouble as much as possible.
So if you work with an artist, then it might be a good idea to just make the prototype with the artist and then convey the art that way to them, and then they can decide what they do about it.
Right, and in a situation like that, if the artist is a good friend of yours, you might say, I know you've gone out of your way to make this art for me for my game. If I succeed, I will give you a portion of the money that they pay me from the company, even if they don't use your art and pay you money for that. So that would be a nice thing to do, but again, try not to get the company involved in what you're doing with your friends, because they don't want to deal with it. It's not their problem.
Yeah, right.
Right. Next question, right by you.
Yeah, so role-playing games and games in general are kind of a niche market.
Yes, absolutely.
So since the royalties are only 3 to 5%, how much money is the average games designer making nowadays?
Not enough to live on. It's still it's still undecided whether I can actually make a living as a full-time game designer on my own as a freelancer.
Do you have a day job in
I do not. This is what I do for a living, and so I'm still working it out. I've only been doing this since October of last year now. I worked for Fantasy Flight Games for 10 years, left them in October and became a freelancer. And of course, I have an unusual situation in that I was able to build up my reputation as a game designer and get my name out there on several very successful products while I worked for a game company. And so I can approach a game company and say, I have an idea for a game. Will you pay me money to make that game for you? Not many people can ever get away with that. And I can barely kind of get away with it. And it depends. And I have to work with kind of smaller companies to talk them into it. Bigger companies, go away, So even there, but because I'm paying my rent and my bills out of game advances and that sort of thing, I have to be kind of upfront with them and say, okay, I'll make you this game. It's going to take me 2 months to make this game for you. Here is what it's going to cost me to survive and pay my bills for 2 months. That is the game advance I want from you in order to make your game. After that, if the game does well, I'll make royalties later on. But in the meantime, no matter what happens with the game, I've paid my rent for those 2 months. And that's how I operate personally. Again, like I said, most people can't do that. They have to have a finished game that they're showing a company. So if I had to, with no previous credits and no previous setup become a full-time game designer, it would be impossible. I wouldn't be able to survive without like several years worth of savings, because you have to pay your bills while the games are being made. You'd have to have a day job, basically, in other words. So I'm kind of trying to give more generalized advice as much as possible so that people who might have a day job and still want to sell a game to a game company can use that advice. But my specific situation doesn't particularly apply to many people, so... all right, next question right here, right in front of you.
Hi, could you talk a little bit about going down the self-publish route? I mean, if you've got a game, would you recommend self-publish initially, and then if it gets interesting, you then go to a game company and show, look, it's already got these sales?
Well, I guess the thing to realize about self-publishing is that when you self-publish a game, you're not a game designer anymore, you're a businessman. Because you are running a business now, and it requires a whole different set of skills than being a game designer. So I myself have run budgets and ordered quotes and had, worked on the production end of games for 10 years as part of my job. So I kind of understand what it takes and what it costs to manufacture a game and to get it shipped from China or wherever and all these other things. But these are all secret, quiet hang-ups that if you don't know about them can destroy you completely financially. There have been Kickstarters where people are selling their houses. They were very successful Kickstarters. In fact, they were so successful that the guy who did it is now broke. And he sold his house, and it's because there are hidden costs and there are quiet costs and that sort of thing. So if you were to go the self-publishing route, if you did like a Kickstarter, for instance, being the common thing that everybody's excited about now, you have to understand it. You have to understand all of the costs that are going to be incurred by the game as you go in, and you can't miss any because that's all coming out of your pocket. If you miss some, there's manufacturing, there is testing to make sure that the game is safe. The little CE mark that costs money to put that on a game. There's shipping to get it from you to there, and then there's shipping again to get it from your warehouse or your living room, wherever you're keeping all these games, to your customers. And all of these costs, they're not obvious unless you've done it. So I would say that unless you're familiar with the manufacturing process of some kind, even if it's not board games, I would be very cautious about it because it's a very dangerous route to go, and there are a lot of hidden costs that can trip you up.
On a related question, would you recommend for a new game designer to try and make a game with minimal components like just a deck of cards so that it could be sold more cheaply and there's lower overheads and the company's taking less risk on you?
My advice for new game designers is to make a great game. If it's a deck of cards and it's a great game, if it's a giant box of stuff and it's a great game, that's your best chance. You want to have something that's going to stand out and be unique on the market. It can't be just another, it's a worker placement game. Okay, and? No, it's a worker placement game. Get out. And that's really what you're going to hear. You have to have something that's going to make your game great, and it's going to be why they're going to buy your game and not the 12 games sitting next to it on the shelf. That's really what a business is going to be interested in, is that aspect of your game. Whether it's big or small, it doesn't matter. But whatever size it's at, like I said earlier, look at those publications, those existing games that are that size, and see what they've got in that box and what they've done. And that gives you an idea of how many components you can fit into the box for the cost that you're looking at, for the price that you're looking at. Because that's how games work, is that the components go in there and they're basically a shopping list of prices, and they add them all up, and here is what each copy of this game costs the company. And that's based on, there's 55 cards, there's 75 wooden tokens, there's 3 sheets of punch board, which has the little cardboard punched into different shapes, and all that adds up, and there's your cost. And that is really the thing. That the one thing is there are certain efficiencies that can be built into that sort of thing. Cards, for instance, are printed on one single sheet of paper, and then a big metal die comes down and stamps them, and now you have 55 cards as they've cut it apart or whatever. Now, the size of that press form, how many cards you can put on one sheet of paper, is your most efficient number of cards that you can use. 55 being a very common one, because typically poker decks come with 52 cards, 2 jokers and 1 rule card. So that in particular is a very common card sheet size, and that's one I often work to. So if you do 55, 110, 165, some multiplier of that, it becomes very efficient. Now, some companies have told me this doesn't matter as much anymore, but that doesn't really make any sense that it wouldn't matter anymore. So I think somebody on the manufacturing end is kind of pulling their leg on that one. No, it won't matter. It's fine. Like, I don't know how that works. So the manufacturing process hasn't changed. They use sheets of paper that they cut into pieces. However many cards you can fit on one sheet is your most efficient number, kind of no matter what they tell you. So hopefully I got your question answered in there when I rambled on a little bit. So, all right, next question. We have one up here. Watch out. There we go with the assist.
About the third-party clauses, about general IPR, how about if a game features characters, likenesses, or names that you'd like to retain IPR? This is a bit more usual in the computer games industry, where you kind of plan to make more games. But how about in board games? How do you feel about that?
Typically, it's not going to happen. If a company is going to publish your game, they're going to want the rights to be able to do a sequel, an expansion to that game. And in order for them to do that, they're going to need the rights to the characters and the IP in that game. If you want to maintain your intellectual property, if you want to own that yourself, then you're looking probably at some form of self-publication. That's how you retain those rights, is you publish it yourself. If someone else publishes it, they're not going to pay you money for the privilege of renting your IP for one game. This doesn't work that way, because it creates long-term legal hassles for them, because now they have to deal with you forever, and that's really not what they want to do. If the game becomes very successful, for instance, and it spawns a number of sequels or whatever, then they're having to renegotiate with you each time. And of course, the first one was very successful, so I'm going to ask for way more money this time, and haha, and they're just like, oh God, really? Can we just publish the game and be done? No, I want more money, and that's what they don't want to have to deal with, and that's why they try and get the full rights and the as much as possible like that. They're simplifying their lives. They're not really being jerks about it. So, next question. Here we go. Look out. Oof.
Okay, can you give a quick rundown on where the different costs generally go in board game? When you were at Fantasy Flight, you probably had some idea of what a percentage goes to the designer, to the art, all the work on the actual shipping, that sort of storage.
I can kind of give you some vague numbers. I can't get too specific. Shipping these days is very expensive, particularly since a lot of manufacturing is done in China, and the reason is that most of the manufacturing plants that are capable of making board games, like we think of them now, are either in China or Germany. There's a couple here and there, but those are the two major manufacturing places. And Germany, on average, will run you 50% more expensive than China will. So so pretty much most people will go China because the savings is so big. So that's kind of where that has gone. So shipping from China is probably a couple $1,000s typically, US, so a bit less than that in euros. But the percentage that goes to the designer is going to be, like I said, that 3 to 5% typically. So whatever royalties are, that's what the designer gets, and that comes again off that chunk, the net chunk of money. And then another big chunk of that money is going to be paid to the manufacturer, person who's actually they're really, we've made these games and we're selling you, 5,000 copies of your game that you designed for this much cost, and so now you can resell this on to somebody else. So the manufacturer is the biggest chunk of those costs. And the big thing about it is there's two types of costs. When you're talking about that, there's first-time costs, first print run cost, and then there are recurring costs. First print run costs are costs that you're only going to have to pay once. So that's things like getting the art paid for, and any kind of thing that you only have to do once, and then you don't have to pay for it again. And this is one reason why game companies love to do reprints, and we've sold through our first print run, now it's time for the second print run. All right. Because not only does it mean the game is being successful, it also means that they don't have to pay that first print run costs again. So how much money they're making on the second print run is usually significantly higher on the first print run, because again, they don't have to pay the artist for a second time. They've already paid them and things like that. So artist money, the money paid to artists is usually a reasonable chunk, but it's a first-time cost. So it's not, especially in a bigger company with bigger scales of economy, that cost becomes very small over time. So that's not as big a deal. The recurring costs are the ones that they're usually worried about. Like if you cram too many components into the game, and you want, and they're taking a wafer-thin profit margin on that, and that's going to be forever for them, because that game's not going to get cheaper. In fact, it's probably going to at some point go up in costs as the manufacturing costs rise over time. You may have noticed a few years ago, Fantasy Flight Games, for instance, raised all their prices by $10 or $20 for their whole line across the board. And that was because manufacturing costs had slowly edged up until they had to raise it again to actually keep making money. So like I said, the biggest chunk is going to be manufacturing and shipping, and the small chunks are actually to the artist and the designer and things like that. The most of that money that they get to keep is going to go for company salaries and things like that. And then, of course, if they're lucky, they'll make some profit on all of this, and if they're well run as a company. So hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of the different costs that go in. I can't really give you percentages because that's going to vary by company. So next question, I guess. Over here on your left. Or your right, my left.
What's the size of this industry? How many companies there are around the world, and what's the market value?
Oh, geez. Well, tabletop games in the United States, the number I have heard, what was it? I think it might have been $1 billion total value for all of the game tabletop things. And that includes Hasbro, which is probably at least half of that, or if not more. And the rest is just kind of split up amongst everybody else. And there's also Wizards of the Coast with Magic the Gathering, and they're another, big chunk of that. And then there's a bunch of little tiny guys, pretty much. And most companies are not really bringing in more than, a couple million a year at most. Maybe the top 4 companies are bringing in more money than that, but that's about it. It's not. There's a saying that if you want to make a small fortune in the game industry, the way to do that is to start with a big fortune. So you don't go to make games to become rich. You do it because you love games and because you want to do that for a living, and that's kind of why I do it, is because I love it. And so I'm trying to very much as possible make it financially feasible for me to keep doing it in the long run. And that's kind of your goal as a designer. If you want to do this all the time, if you want this to be your day job, is just to kind of creep up on how much money you're making each year in royalties or what have you, to the point where now, okay, I feel like I can live on this, and then you can cut the umbilical cord. But that's going to be maybe 10 people in the world can do that, if that. So it's very difficult, and it's a very competitive, tight market. The number of companies out there, actually probably a couple hundred maybe around the world if you count everybody. Not a ton of salaried positions for game designers. I've heard of maybe 50 total ever, unless you're counting the video game industry, which I kind of count separately from the tabletop industry. They're kind of very different markets and different types of companies. So it's small potatoes really. But the rewards come in other ways typically. So, all right, next question. We have one up here, maybe. Look out.
So speaking of salary jobs, what was it like working at Fantasy Flight Games? Did you have your own? Did you have like a big office building where you had weekly meetings, or were you all freelancers working at home and talking to each other on Skype and such?
No, there are companies that operate like that second example you're talking about. I want to say Alderac Entertainment Group. They do Legend of the Five Rings. They're a kind of a telecommuting company these days. But Fantasy Flight Games has a big office building and about 100 people working there these days. Although when I started, there was 10 of us. And it was a much smaller office building at the time. But as managers and everything, and you have your meetings, and it's still kind of similar to what I do now, except that in that case, my manager would come to me and he would say, okay, this month, this is what you're designing. We need you to make a game based on Doom, the video game, and you have 2 months to do that in, or whatever. And then it would be my job to hit that deadline. And however I did that was up to me, but I had to do it. So that was kind of my experience as a salaried game designer, is race the deadlines.
So no creative freedom.
There's enough. I mean, I could have made whatever game I wanted out of Doom the video game, but I chose to make Doom the board game the way it is, and so that's really where your creative freedom is. You're working inside a box, but you can put anything you want in that box, really, assuming, of course, that your employer and your boss likes what you've done and believes that it'll sell in the market. So we have about 5 minutes left. So maybe one more question, I think. Right back here in the silver.
Do you have any anecdotes or stories about biggest mistakes or screw-ups you've seen in this, and how they could have been maybe avoided, or how they prevented a game being published?
Let's see. I would have to go with one of the things, if you're dealing with a manufacturer, if you're communicating, if you're doing self-publishing, or for whatever reason dealing with a manufacturer, it's very important to communicate very clearly and capably with them, because if they don't understand what it is you're asking them to make, they're going to screw it up. And an example of this is Android the board game. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but in there's a jigsaw puzzle piece that is glued to the board. And to get them to do this was kind of an epic task. They sent they screwed it up several times, and then the one that I will remember to my dying day is they sent me a photo where what they had done is that I had this space graphic design. I said, okay, put this outline on the board so they know where to glue so then the company, the factory workers know where to glue the piece. And so what they had done is they had taken like a jigsaw and cut that out, and then glued the piece inside the board so that it was flush. And I was just like, why would you do this? What have you done? How did you get this out of what I was asking for? And they're like, oh, you want it glued on top of the board. Like, yes, not inside the board. Why would I glue it inside the board? Why wouldn't we just print that? Just never mind, just glue it on top of the board, and so it can be very difficult to communicate to what you want specifically. So these days we use diagrams as well as text and kind of draw out what you want. And I think that was like one of the bigger things that I've ever encountered, where it was just like, whoa, what happened here? In terms of over the years of the things I've run into. So, all right. I think we're getting ready to clear out for the next crowd here, pretty much. So thank you all for coming. Feel free to come up and ask me some questions as I'm packing up and everything, but appreciate you coming. I hope you have success in your game designs. I hope you sell some games to some companies, and I hope to see you as colleagues in the future.
Ropecon.